Welcome to Property Defense Chronicles, where we share the most incredible stories of homeowners fighting back against entitled neighbors and corrupt HOAs. Today's story features a 78-year-old Korean War veteran, a power-hungry board president, and the most brilliant property defense strategy you'll ever hear. My name is Tommy Chen, and this is the story of how my grandfather, Henry Chen, single-handedly destroyed an entire HOA board after they made the fatal mistake of underestimating a man who'd survived combat, built a successful construction business from nothing, and had absolutely zero tolerance for bullies. 3 years ago, my grandfather Henry owned a beautiful 2-acre property in Meadowbrook Estates, an upscale community outside Austin, Texas. The property had been in our family since 1987, long before the surrounding area was developed into the gated community it became. Grandpa's land was like an island of old Texas charm surrounded by modern suburban perfection. The house was a classic 1960s ranch-style home that Grandpa had renovated and expanded over the decades. It featured a wraparound porch, a large workshop where he crafted furniture as a hobby, and extensive gardens that my grandmother had lovingly maintained until her passing 5 years earlier. The property was completely fenced with a 6-foot privacy fence that Grandpa had installed in 2010. When Meadowbrook Estates was developed around our property in 2018, the developers had approached Grandpa multiple times with increasingly generous offers. They wanted to incorporate his land into their master plan, but Henry Chen was not a man who could be bought or intimidated. "This land represents 40 years of my life," he told me. "Your grandmother's roses are planted here. I built that workshop with my own hands. These developers can build around me, but they're not getting my property." The developers eventually gave up and built around us, creating a situation where Grandpa's property became completely surrounded by the new gated community. An easement provided legal access to his land through Meadowbrook's main entrance, but the arrangement created tensions that would eventually explode into warfare. For the first 2 years, everything was relatively peaceful. Grandpa kept to himself, maintained his property immaculately, and had polite relationships with his new neighbors. The HOA left him alone, understanding that his property predated their community and wasn't subject to their rules. That all changed when Derek Morrison became HOA president in January 2023. Morrison was a 45-year-old real estate developer who'd moved to Meadowbrook the previous year after making millions flipping luxury properties in California. He was arrogant, entitled, and completely convinced that his wealth and business success made him superior to everyone around him. He drove a white Tesla Model S with vanity plates reading Luxury One and treated the HOA presidency like his personal kingdom. Morrison's first act as president was to launch what he called a comprehensive property value enhancement initiative. His real goal was to find ways to force Grandpa off his land so the HOA could acquire the property and develop it according to community standards. The trouble started in February when Morrison sent Grandpa a letter claiming that his non-conforming property was negatively affecting neighborhood property values and demanding a meeting to discuss integration options. Grandpa's response was polite but firm. His property wasn't part of the HOA, he had no legal obligation to meet with them, and he'd appreciate being left alone to enjoy his retirement in peace. Morrison didn't take rejection well. Within 2 weeks, strange things began happening around Grandpa's property. HOA board members would walk along his fence line, taking photos and measurements. They'd peer over the fence, examining his gardens and workshop. When Grandpa asked what they were doing, they claimed to be conducting property assessments for community planning purposes. The situation escalated in March when Grandpa caught Morrison himself climbing over the back fence at 6:30 in the morning. When confronted, Morrison claimed he was investigating potential code violations and that the HOA had the right to inspect any property that might affect community standards. "Mr. Morrison," Grandpa said with the calm authority of a man who'd faced down enemy soldiers, "this is private property, and you're trespassing. I'm asking you politely to leave and not return without permission." Morrison's response was pure entitled arrogance. "Listen, old man, this community has standards to maintain. Your hillbilly property is dragging down everyone's home values. Either you work with us voluntarily, or we'll find other ways to address the problem." That was Derek Morrison's first major mistake, threatening a Korean War combat veteran who'd spent his entire life standing up to bullies. Over the following weeks, the trespassing incidents escalated dramatically. Board members would climb the fence at different times of day, always claiming they were inspecting something or conducting community assessments. They'd walk through Grandpa's gardens, examine his workshop, and even peer through windows of his house. Grandpa documented every incident with photographs and written reports, but the local sheriff's department seemed reluctant to get involved in what they viewed as a neighbor dispute. The deputies would respond to trespassing calls, but Morrison and his board members always claimed they were conducting HOA business and that there must be some misunderstanding about property boundaries. The breaking point came in April when Grandpa caught 3 board members not just trespassing, but actually attempting to remove plants from his garden. They claimed that certain trees and bushes were encroaching on community property and needed to be relocated. When Grandpa confronted them, Morrison's wife Sandra sneered at him. "These plants are probably diseased anyway. This whole property is an eyesore that needs professional attention." That evening, Grandpa called me with a request that initially seemed strange. "Tommy," he said, "I need you to help me research property law, historical records, and some legal documents I've got stored in my office safe. These HO people have no idea who they're dealing with, and I think it's time they learned a lesson they'll never forget." I drove down from Dallas that weekend, expecting to help Grandpa file police reports or hire an attorney to deal with the trespassing problem. What I found instead was a man with a strategic mind and a plan that would make military tacticians proud. Grandpa had been quietly researching Meadowbrook Estate's development history, HOA governance documents, and the legal framework governing his property's relationship with the surrounding community. What he'd discovered was fascinating and potentially explosive. "Tommy," he said, spreading documents across his dining room table, "these HOA people think they're dealing with some ignorant old farmer they can bully off his land. They have no idea that I've been in the construction business for 50 years and I understand property law better than most attorneys." He showed me the original development plans for Meadowbrook Estates, which he'd obtained from county records. The developers had been required to provide specific legal protections for his property, including permanent access easements, utility rights, and environmental protections for the creek that ran through his land. "Here's where it gets interesting," Grandpa said, pointing to a document I'd never seen before. "When the developers built this community, they needed my permission to connect to the water main that runs under my property. I agreed, but only with specific conditions." The document was a utility easement agreement that granted Meadowbrook Estates the right to connect to water services through Grandpa's land. In exchange, the HOA had agreed to maintain the water infrastructure, respect his property rights, and ensure that community members wouldn't harass or trespass on his land. "Tommy, every house in Meadowbrook Estates gets its water through lines that run under my property. The HOA signed an agreement promising to prevent exactly the kind of harassment they're now engaging in." But that wasn't the most shocking discovery. Grandpa pulled out a thick folder of financial documents. I also learned something interesting about Mr. Morrison's background. His real estate development company went bankrupt in California and has got over $2 million in outstanding debts. He moved to Texas to avoid creditors. How does that affect the HOA situation? Because Morrison has been using his position as HOA president to funnel community funds to his personal accounts. He's been approving contracts for his own shell companies and embezzling money that belongs to the homeowners. Over the following weeks, we documented everything: the trespassing incidents, Morrison's financial crimes, and the HOA's violation of the utility easement agreement. But Grandpa wasn't ready to reveal his hand yet. "In the military, we called it reconnaissance," he explained. "You gather intelligence, understand your enemy's weaknesses, and then strike when they least expect it." The opportunity came in May when Morrison made his biggest mistake yet. Frustrated by his inability to intimidate Grandpa through trespassing and harassment, Morrison decided to escalate to outright sabotage. He convinced the HOA board to approve emergency vegetation management along community property lines, which gave them an excuse to bring commercial landscaping equipment onto Grandpa's land. On a Thursday morning, Grandpa woke up to find a crew of landscapers with chainsaws and heavy machinery cutting down trees and removing plants from his property. Morrison was directing the operation, claiming that the vegetation posed a safety hazard to the community. Grandpa called the sheriff's department, but Morrison had prepared for this. He showed the deputies a forged work order claiming that the county had ordered the vegetation removal due to fire safety concerns. The deputies, not wanting to get involved in what seemed like a complex property dispute, told both sides to resolve it through the courts. That's when Henry Chen decided it was time for war. First, Grandpa called his attorney and filed for an emergency restraining order to stop the vegetation removal. But more importantly, he implemented a strategy that would expose Morrison's crimes and destroy the entire corrupt HOA board. Grandpa had discovered that the upcoming annual HOA meeting was scheduled for the third Saturday in May. According to community bylaws, any property owner affected by HOA decisions had the right to address the membership during the public comment period. While Grandpa's property wasn't technically part of the HOA, the utility easement agreement gave him certain rights as an affected party in community governance. Morrison had no idea that Grandpa possessed legal standing to participate in HOA meetings. On the day of the annual meeting, Grandpa arrived at the community center with me, his attorney, and several boxes of documents. The meeting room was packed with homeowners who'd heard rumors about the conflict with the old man on the hill. Morrison opened the meeting with a smug presentation about community improvements and property value enhancement initiatives. He talked about removing non-conforming elements from the neighborhood and praised the board's proactive approach to maintaining standards. When it came time for public comments, Grandpa stood up and requested permission to address the community. Morrison's face went pale when he saw Grandpa in the room. "Sir, this is a closed meeting for HOA members only." Grandpa's attorney stood up. "Mr. Morrison, my client has legal standing under the utility easement agreement signed by this HOA. He has the right to address matters that affect his property interests." Morrison tried to argue, but the attorney presented copies of the easement agreement and relevant state law. Faced with the threat of legal action, Morrison was forced to allow Grandpa to speak. What followed was 20 minutes of the most devastating legal destruction I've ever witnessed. Grandpa began by projecting photographs of every trespassing incident, complete with dates, times, and identification of the board members involved. He showed pictures of Morrison climbing his fence, board members stealing plants, and the unauthorized vegetation removal operation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Grandpa said in the calm voice that had commanded respect for 7 decades, "your HOA board has been systematically violating my property rights, breaking the law, and breaching their legal obligations under our utility easement agreement." He then revealed the financial crimes he'd uncovered. Using documents obtained through public records requests, Grandpa showed how Morrison had been embezzling community funds, approving fraudulent contracts, and using HOA resources to pay his personal debts. "Mr. Morrison owes over $2 million to California creditors and has been stealing your money to pay his obligations. Every contract is approved, every community improvement project is championed, has been designed to funnel money into his personal accounts." The room erupted in shocked conversation as homeowners realized they'd been defrauded by their own president. But Grandpa wasn't finished. "Here's what Mr. Morrison and his board don't understand about property law," Grandpa continued, pulling out the utility easement agreement. "Every home in this community receives water through infrastructure that crosses my land. This HOA signed a legal agreement promising to respect my property rights and prevent harassment from community members." He showed the crowd photographs of the damaged trees and plants from Morrison's sabotage operation. "By engaging in trespassing, harassment, and unauthorized destruction of my property, this board has violated the utility easement agreement. Under the terms of that contract, I have the right to terminate water access to the entire community." The silence in the room was deafening as people realized what Grandpa was saying. "I don't want to punish innocent homeowners for their board's crimes," Grandpa said, "but I will not tolerate continued harassment and trespassing. This board has 30 days to resign, make restitution for the damage they've caused, and implement policies ensuring that my property rights are respected." Morrison tried to dispute Grandpa's claims, but the evidence was overwhelming. Homeowners were pulling out their phones to call attorneys, accountants, and real estate agents to verify what they'd just heard. The meeting devolved into chaos as community members demanded Morrison's resignation and threatened lawsuits over the embezzled funds. Board members were frantically trying to distance themselves from Morrison's schemes, claiming they'd been unaware of his financial crimes. The coup de grace came when Grandpa revealed his final surprise. "There's one more thing this community should know," he said, pulling out a thick legal document. "6 months ago, I was approached by a legitimate development company that wants to build a luxury resort on my property. I've been considering their offer because I'm 78 years old and ready to simplify my life." He held up the development proposal, which outlined plans for a 200-room resort and conference center that would generate massive tax revenue for the county. However, the resort company requires guaranteed water access for their facility. "If this HOA continues to breach our easement agreement through harassment and trespassing, I'll be forced to consider alternative water arrangements that might not be compatible with residential use." The implication was clear. Continued harassment could result in Grandpa selling his property to developers who might cut off water access to the entire community. Morrison's face was purple with rage and panic. You can't threaten an entire community over a property dispute. I'm not threatening anyone, Mr. Morrison. I'm simply explaining the legal consequences of your actions. You've breached a contract, committed crimes, and stolen money from these homeowners. The choice about how to proceed is entirely yours. The annual meeting ended with a unanimous vote of no confidence in Morrison and the entire board. Emergency elections were scheduled for the following month, and a forensic accounting firm was hired to investigate the financial crimes. Morrison's resignation letter arrived by certified mail 3 days later, along with a check for $15,000 to cover the damage from his vegetation removal operation. He put his house on the market the following week and fled Texas before criminal charges could be filed. The forensic audit revealed that Morrison had stolen over $200,000 from the HOA through various schemes. The new board, led by retired Air Force Colonel Janet Martinez, implemented strict financial controls and established a community relations committee to ensure respectful relationships with neighboring properties. 6 months later, Grandpa received a formal apology from the HOA and a plaque recognizing his distinguished service to community harmony. The trespassing stopped completely, and his property rights were formally acknowledged in the HOA's governing documents. Today, Grandpa still lives peacefully on his 2 acres, tending his rebuilt garden and working in his shop. The resort development never happened. It had been a strategic bluff designed to demonstrate the potential consequences of continued harassment. Morrison's bankruptcy caught up with him in Nevada, where he was arrested on fraud charges related to his California business dealings. His Meadowbrook house sold at a significant loss, with proceeds going to pay restitution to the HOA. The experience taught everyone valuable lessons about respecting property rights, understanding legal agreements, and the dangers of underestimating people based on age or appearance. Morrison thought he was dealing with a helpless old man who could be bullied off valuable land. Instead, he'd picked a fight with a combat veteran, successful businessman, and legal strategist who had decades of experience dealing with people who thought money and arrogance made them invincible. Grandpa's favorite part of the whole saga was Morrison's face when he realized that the hillbilly property he'd been trying to steal was actually the key to the entire community's water supply. The man who thought he could intimidate a Korean War veteran had been outmaneuvered by someone with more experience, more intelligence, and a better understanding of both property law and human nature. Never underestimate your opponent, Grandpa told me after it was all over. Morrison saw an old man living alone and thought I'd be an easy target. He never bothered to research who he was dealing with or understand the legal implications of his actions. The story spread throughout the Austin area real estate community, serving as a cautionary tale about HOA overreach and the importance of respecting property rights. Several law firms now use Grandpa's case as an example in their property law seminars. As for the fence that Morrison and his cronies kept climbing, it's still there, 6 feet tall and solid as ever. But now it's decorated with security cameras, motion sensors, and a large sign that reads, "Private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law." Nobody climbs that fence anymore. Sometimes the best way to deal with bullies isn't to fight them on their terms. It's to use their own arrogance and ignorance against them. Morrison spent months trying to intimidate someone who had legal advantages, superior knowledge, and the strategic patience to let his enemies destroy themselves. Henry Chen didn't just defend his property, he taught an entire community about respect, legal accountability, and the dangerous consequences of assuming that age equals weakness. The HOA learned their lesson the hard way, and they'll never forget the shocking education they received from the quiet man on the hill.